morning, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to see you all here, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm coming to you from today, and all the lands from which we're joining today. The Gadigal people of the Eora Nation are the people that I'm paying my respects to today. Their elders, past, present, and emerging leaders. And we're so pleased and delighted to get to work with so many leaders in the First Nations data sovereignty space. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. We've had the chance to work with so many of you over the last 12 months. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce you all to Dr. Ian Oppermann, who really does need no introduction, but nevertheless, I would say that any of us who've worked in data and data science in the public sector or in the social sector would know how much Ian has contributed and continues to contribute to this vision for all people having access to data for better decisions across society. There's a podcast that we just recorded, which I'll drop into the chat later with Ian, about his work, the many projects he did, more than 50, I think it was, Ian, when you were the chief data scientist or the head of the New South Wales Data Analytics Centre. And I think we go into some really deep conversation around that experience that you had. Now your role as the New South Wales chief data scientist, you really are pivotal in supporting data sharing within New South Wales standards, the AI strategy, and you're working nationally as well. So it's just such a pleasure to have you here and to share with our incredible network of Seer customers and partners who are joining us today, the work that you've been doing and help us understand what's happened this year. I think we understand it's a pretty pivotal moment insofar as data and data sharing. And I'd love to know what you see in the next 12 months. So I'm going to hand to you in a moment and let everyone know who's here. And thank you everyone for joining. It's a great pleasure to see you. You will have the chance to ask questions of Ian and drop questions into the chat as well. So by all means, please drop questions into the chat and we'll have at least 15 to 20 minutes for a conversation after Ian's opening remarks. So thanks everyone, and over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Christy, and I'm joining you today also from the land of the Gadigal people. Thanks very much for having me. I have to say I do recognise a few of the names and faces on the screen in front of me, so I'll have to behave myself and stick as closely as possible to what actually happened. There has been, as you know, a lot going on in the world of data, and I thought it might just be worth sharing at least the parts that I've been involved in from the perspective of a couple of different lenses. I spend my time these days as the Chief Data Scientist for New South Wales Government primarily focused on three areas: smart cities, smart places, artificial intelligence, data sharing frameworks. I also spend some of my time acting as an industry professor at the University of Technology in Sydney, where I'm principally focused on smart cities. I spend also some of my time as the president of the Australian Computer Society, principally focused on data sharing, AI, and smart cities. And I spend some of my time as the chair of a variety of different standards organisations. But in all cases, those three domains are what I've been focused on. And it may seem not so relevant to talk about smart cities or AI for this group, but there are a couple of really important thematic elements which ultimately speak to the appropriateness of use of data, speak to trust and trustworthiness, and speak to data sharing frameworks which underpin ultimately AI as a use case of data, and also smart cities, smart places as a use case of data. So with that sort of general web introduction, smart cities and smart places, it's been a big year in Australia, and it's been a big year in New South Wales, and it's been a big year in the world of standards. There have been, in New South Wales, we released the Smart Places strategy last year, which said that we're going to do a couple of important things. We're going to talk about bringing places to life through use of data and bringing places to life what we're going to describe in terms of outcomes. The outcomes are built around livability, accessibility, sustainability, resilience. And those outcomes frameworks, or those outcomes, really speak to real world changes in the way we're looking to activate places, the way we're looking to engage with communities, and the way we're looking to use data to understand what's happening on the ground, be able to do what we call root cause diagnostics, what happens when something goes wrong, what are the different factors that lead to that, do some predictive capability and actually explore what if scenario planning to help with a whole lot of things that communities need to understand what's happening on the ground, situational awareness. We need to be able to plan and adapt and do things like predictive maintenance. We also need to be able to explore what happens when different activities take place. So the what if scenario planning. COVID showed us just how important it is to understand what's happening on the ground around us. It showed us the importance of being able to understand the implications of different sorts of actions. And it showed us that fine-grained spatial data, fine-grained temporal data, fine-grained data about what's happening in the community really matters. And it's important to be able to gain access to that data, but it's important to be able to gain access in a way which is appropriate. And so the use is appropriate, the understanding of it is appropriate, the context around it is appropriate, and how far we can use that, how much we can rely on what we can infer from that data. It's also really important to understand where we sit. So some really important aspects about the smart places in particular in New South Wales. We released a strategy, that's one thing. We activated that strategy in terms of guidance and outcomes frameworks and a whole variety of other mechanisms. But we also released in New South Wales a customer charter to say, this is what we will do with your data, and this is what we won't do with your data. And we've been slowly but surely building out frameworks for appropriate use of data around all of the mechanisms and governance that we need to put in place to address the sensitivities associated with data use. And with all things, we're looking to demonstrate that we've got technical capability, that we have the governance frameworks in place, that we've got the really publicly declared outcomes that we're looking to deliver on, which are all principles-based. And then we've got those clear indicators to say that this is what we mean by those outcomes. Now, interestingly also, smart places are places that are activated through interaction of Commonwealth government, state government, local communities, local industry, and represent about as complex a set of interactions as you can possibly have. And it teaches us a lot about the appropriateness of use of data and also the importance of interoperable frameworks around the use of data. Staying just briefly in that space, there's also a lot of work for standards in smart cities and smart places. So I'm working with Standards Australia to produce a landscape map of all the relevant standards, or the most relevant standards that you need in order to think about not only knowing and understanding and building smart places, but also some of the underpinning technologies, such as not only the data sharing, but in fact, artificial intelligence, digital twins, the use of a whole range of different sorts of specific technologies, such as Internet of Things, cybersecurity, and 5G, literally just to name a few. And that landscape map, I'm hoping, is a useful way in for people to think about planning and operating and developing and maturing smart places. Moving on to the next focus area is artificial intelligence. Now, in New South Wales, we've just released, in fact, just last Thursday, New South Wales Cabinet endorsed the first ever general artificial intelligence assurance framework for any government or any jurisdiction in Australia. And the assurance framework effectively says, we're going to think about the use of data specifically for artificial intelligence from the perspective of not only what we're trying to achieve, again, that issue of outcomes, but also potential harms that could arise as a result of use of artificial intelligence, but not just incidental, not just explicit harms from a direct application of AI. Could, for example, an automated decision lead to a bad outcome? And we all have examples of bad outcomes that we've heard of. But for example, if a decision leads to an action, such as a door opening or closing, or something else happening, a real change in the real world, what are those potential harms? but also what are the unintended or secondary harms that could arise from the use of AI, or harms that could arise from the repeated application of AI. So again, some of the common thematic elements we're thinking about with artificial intelligence are, what are the outcomes we're looking to deliver? Where are we in that journey of, or that life cycle of the data? And we need to understand enough about how we collected it, enough about how we've stored it, how we've used it, the authorizing framework that gets us to the point where we're about to use it. The chain of provenance, the chain of custody, the chain of authorizing frameworks, the chain of issues related to data quality, so that when we're about to use it for feeding into an artificial intelligence algorithm, we know whether or not it's fit for purpose. We have a sense of how much we can rely on the result, and we have a sense of whether or not it's an interesting insight, whether it's an insight that we could really act on, whether it's an insight that we would allow a device to make a decision about, or it's an insight that we would actually allow a device to go all the way through to completion of an action in the real world. And that, believe it or not, has some very common aspects to what I was just describing in terms of smart cities and smart places. We need trusted governance frameworks to allow us to ensure that we are doing the right thing with the data. We need an appropriate understanding of the chain of custody, the chain of provenance, the chain of authorizing framework until we're about to act on it. But then we have a bigger question about, is it appropriate, or how appropriate, how much can we rely on that data generated insight? And so the frameworks we've been looking at with smart cities and smart places are very, very similar to the frameworks we're looking at for artificial intelligence. But it's a way into that data lifecycle. It's a way into that use of data from a particular perspective, which is we're about to use it to feed an algorithm. And again, the intersecting forces there. New South Wales produced its AI strategy last year. We've produced the assurance framework this year. It has been a labour of love as we've tested this assurance framework with the folks in transport, with the folks in the building commissioner, with health, and ultimately with the folks at police, to look at, again, all those different issues that lead us up to use of data, and then the understanding of what we could do in terms of our confidence in the result, and then ultimately question what we should do in terms of appropriate use. And wonderfully, this is where I think the conversation is going with data sharing and use. New South Wales will, of course, share that AI assurance framework with every jurisdiction that's interested. We have explicitly said we look to assist other states and territories with their own assurance framework development. We've been working very closely with the World of Standards. So there's a group that are really focused on specific AI management, data quality for AI, governance for AI. And that group is part of that bigger picture of the smart places landscape that we're looking at with Standards Australia. But then, of course, there's data sharing. And again, it always seems a little bit like putting the cart before the horse, that last year we released our smart places strategy. Last year we released our AI strategy. This year we released our data strategy. But in fact, it is the right way around, because data is the big game. Data is, in fact, where everything ultimately has its foundations. And I'm pleased to say that it has been a really joined up exercise this year around developing data sharing frameworks. Let me start with work happening at the Commonwealth. I mean, you will know, of course, that the Data Availability and Transparency Bill, which has been discussed for a very long time, speaks to some of those really big challenges of the Commonwealth sharing data with itself. Broadly speaking, people don't share data or hesitant to share data because of a cultural unwillingness, capacity or availability to share data, the unable part, or in fact, in some cases, concern that they're not allowed. So the unwilling, unable, not allowed, three broad areas that people really are challenged with sharing data. The Data Availability and Transparency Bill, which is still not through after more than, well, in fact, many years of preparation, tries to speak to that of the unwilling, unable, not allowed. It speaks to the not allowed unless, in fact, you are allowed, except under very special circumstances. By default, the Commonwealth should be able to share data with itself. The states and territories engaged. It was, in fact, this time last year, we engaged in an exercise to see whether or not that Data Availability and Transparency Bill would assist with sharing data with the states. And we started to think about the mechanisms that we could preemptively approach, or the advice that we might preemptively ask for to help with the data sharing between states and Commonwealth. But it's an instrument which is the result of a great deal of consultation, and the ability to influence at this point is very, very limited. And we hope that it will help with the Commonwealth, but we think there's still some work to be done in terms of that being a way of sharing data with the states and territories. So there's a second piece of work which has also been quite important, and that's the Intergovernmental Agreement on Data Sharing, which was all during COVID. The states and territories have been meeting on a very, very frequent basis to talk about data that we need to understand, that situational awareness associated with the impact of the pandemic, data associated with our understanding of economic impact and economic recovery, and data for a whole range of other purposes, thinking through that range of human services delivery of economic and environmental impact. And to be fair, with the best will in the world, it was really, really difficult to get data which was at fine-grained level without in fact really trying to create a storm about it. So we were still dealing with, earlier this year, the unwilling part of the data sharing. And the unwilling, again, comes from a whole lot of concerns about unintended consequences, about the use of data and the life cycle of data. That all changed earlier this year, where the Prime Minister got directly involved and said, you will share data, find a mechanism to do it. So during the course of this year, we've been working on a couple of big data programs in order to assist or give focus to data sharing between the states and the Commonwealth. And they have included a natural hazards application to take fires near me, for those in New South Wales who know that application, to ensure that it covers not just fires, but some other natural hazards, and allows data to be shared across state and Commonwealth boundaries, so that we can have the fire doesn't disappear when it reaches the Queensland border, or doesn't disappear when it reaches the Victorian border. We're also looking at waste management. We're looking at road safety. We've focused on enhancing data sharing for closing the gap. We're looking at veterans' health. We're looking at also building a national disability data asset. And all of these give focus to the different sorts of data that we have in the different sorts of environments. Data which is sensitive and personal, data which is sensitive and not personal, data which is not sensitive and personal, and ultimately we're looking for data which we can release as open data. The reform, however, is fundamentally underpinned by the need to build the framework. So out of the unwilling, we've addressed that. Out of the not allowed, we are addressing that. The unable part is what we're looking to put in place with data sharing frameworks. And some of those same principles that I was talking about with smart cities and smart places and AI really are just expressions of the frameworks that you need to put in place for data sharing from a more generic perspective. There are a couple of things about data sharing frameworks that we've been now slowly but surely building. And I'll give you a little bit of good news about some resources we've just released. But some aspects about data sharing that we've been working on, using the examples with the Commonwealth and states, using examples that just what has been learned over the years within New South Wales government, working with the data analytics center. There are a couple of really important aspects. The why of data sharing really matters. It matters so much. And this is something that I've understood for years, but have really only genuinely internalized during the course of this year. The why of data sharing matters enormously, why you want to do it. Now, there's a good and a bad about that. If you're specifically using sensitive data for really important, clear purposes, there's a much greater willingness to share. COVID has demonstrated a really clear purpose and a really great focus for national benefit for data sharing. And that why response to either the health or the economic impact of COVID has really given great clarity and helped everybody move forward in their willingness to share data. But of course, sometimes we don't have it a very specific why. Sometimes it's much more of an investigatory effort, a research effort. So the why, in a more general sense, means that the sorts of data we deal with and the sorts of environments we need to put in place really change depending on just how clear our why is, our purpose, our reason for doing something. The other important aspect about the data frameworks we've been developing is an understanding that not all data sets are the same. Now, broadly speaking, we've been talking about very sensitive and very personal data sets and separating out the degree of personal information and link to the identified data set from all the sensitivities associated with the use of that data. So issues around how did we get it? Did we have the right to collect it? Do we understand the context of it? Do we understand the data quality? Is it fit for purpose? And again, can we rely on any insights we generate from use of it? Separating out sensitive and personal was first of all a big step, but then understanding that some data sets are much more personal than others. They contain much more, even if de-identified, they contain much more personal information than others. So the sort of data sets we've been looking at for example, the NDIS reform clearly are linked to de-identified, very rich data sets, which are very personal and very sensitive, even though de-identified. The likelihood of being able to re-identify an individual is not zero. In fact, it's quite high and needs to be treated with great care. And we need to be really careful about who gets access for what purpose. But there are other data sets, such as the data we're using for waste management. It's actually not very personal at all, but it has commercial sensitivities in there. So the governance we need to put in place is quite different to what we would do for a national disability data asset. Other data sets are not very sensitive at all, but actually contain personal information, so typically transport data, and those data sets associated with tap on, tap off. Tap on, tap off for a journey is not sensitive compared to the use of data for NDIS reform, but clearly has very significant elements of personal information because a couple of taps and you can very quickly identify a unique journey, and from a unique journey, it's not too hard to identify a unique individual. And in some cases, of course, we want data sets that we can release openly as open data that we can say should not be personal and should not be sensitive. So understanding that all data sets, not all data sets are the same. And in fact, we can broadly categorize them according to level of sensitivity or level of personal information and build different governance. That's a really important foundational piece for thinking about data sharing frameworks. But another really important piece is actually trying to understand that data lifecycle. And this is what really confounds people. If you've ever been in a situation where someone has come and asked you for access to a people-centered data set, de-identified, that you're carefully curating and protecting and acting as a data custodian for, the ice-cold chill that runs through your bones when people ask for your data is, what's going to happen with it? I give it to you, you use it, what happens next? Do you then, on use it, do you create data products? Do you create insights that escape out there in the wild and they create potential harms? Being able to understand that it's important to think about that data lifecycle, and the debilitating issue for data custodians is trying to think through the next step and the next step and the next step and the next step and the next step as data lifecycles can spin and circulate and twist and do all sorts of things. And as a consequence, often what happens is the answer is either, no, I will not give you this data, or I will only give it to you under really, really strict conditions, or I'll only give you a version of this data that we would release as open data anyway. And during the early stages of the pandemic, the conversation between the states and territories, it was very much that I will share data with you either in an extremely closed down, locked down environment where we control every aspect of access to that data, or we'll give you data that will go to release as open data anyway. We might just accelerate that open release of data. So an understanding that it's important to understand the data lifecycle and the controls you need to put in place for the next step, bearing in mind there will be a next step. Getting a handle on that, understanding that there are different governance frameworks depending on sensitivity and level of personal information, understanding that we can build out metadata under ideal cases, or at least understand the metadata that's available and or missing on that chain of provenance, that chain of custody, that chain of data quality. Understanding all of that actually helps us start to think through just what sort of controls we do need to put in place for what sort of data, so that we can demonstrate that we're doing the right thing with data sharing frameworks. And as I mentioned, there is a little bit of good news here. Last Thursday was a big day for New South Wales, in my humble opinion. Not only did New South Wales Cabinet endorse the AI assurance framework, that was our win by noon last Thursday. Later in the evening, Minister Dominello, who many of you I hope will know, launched the fourth in the series of technical white papers from the Australian Computer Society, which describes data sharing frameworks from the perspective of, depending on how you look at it, trustworthiness, we need to demonstrate these aspects of trustworthiness in our data sharing frameworks, or if you like, from the perspective of control. These are the controls we must put in place in order to be trustworthy with these data sharing frameworks. What it tries to do is to take the near infinite number of possible combinations of context, of data type, of data sharing arrangements, and link them into, in this case, we used 5 different types of data sharing environments. A really high control, really high trustworthiness environment, high trust environment, through to a high control, high trust environment, all the way through to a no control, no trust environment, and characterize those based on the governance, based on the technical capability, based on the authorizing frameworks, and based on an understanding of enough of the data lifecycle so that when you're about to use, when you're about to share either data or a data product, you have a better understanding of the set of options that you can move through with those different environments, or the set of requirements that in order to maintain a high trust, high control environment that you need to do in order for that next step to also be high trust, high control. And if you don't do it, then actually you're not in a high trust, high control environment, you're in a different environment. We tried to bring it to life through a few examples. One of my favorite example is the daily release of COVID data in New South Wales. And yes, it had a pretty New South Wales flavour. There were a lot of New South Wales folks involved, but this Australian Computer Society paper was actually the product of a lot of engagement from a lot of different jurisdictions and a lot of different groups. It included Data 61, the Bureau of Statistics, the Institute for Health and Welfare, colleagues in particular from South Australia, Victoria and Queensland, and the world of standards, not too surprisingly, all actually working together to try and crack this nut of coming up with a useful framework for data sharing, and brought to life with a couple of examples. And again, the out-of-home care is one that I will come back to, but the daily release of COVID data was probably the most illustrative, because what we have there is really sensitive and personal data being collected at point of source. These are confirmed COVID cases for this individual at this day, on this day, in this postcode. Those data sets being linked and worked through to the point where we analyze it in the Data Analytics Center on an every single day basis in a very high trust, very high control environment, collect, transmit, store, organize, analyze, and then from that, an analysis of raw data, some data products are created. And if there is a level of personal information in those data products, which is lower than a particular threshold that we've all agreed on with Health and with the Privacy Commissioner, then we will release those data products. The raw data itself, the original raw data, remains protected, but we generate data products. We reduce the level of personal information in those data products compared to the raw data. If that ratio is met that we're comfortable with, we release them as open data. And anyone that's accessed either the COVID confirmed cases or testing cases in New South Wales, that data goes through the process of really tight control, creation of data products, and that data products released into a no control environment, which is a way of not only understanding where we sit in those different levels of control, but providing a different type of access to a different data product for a different level of control or a different level of trustworthiness of environment. So that's an example of actually trying to bring that to life. The paper was released, the technical white paper was released. You can download it from the Australian Computer Society website. Lovely photograph of Minister Dominello in there, and lots of thanks to lots of folks who've been involved. Maybe there are even some of the folks on the call, I'm not quite sure. But a labour of love and some resources and some tools and some frameworks to say this is how we think we should do it. Bringing all that together, of course, means that we are trying to connect and have one conversation around data sharing and use. And that technical white paper is actually now helping to inform the frameworks for the Intergovernmental Agreement. So we're getting the unwilling. In fact, the unwilling is sorted, that conversation is done. We're getting the not allowed, that's almost there. The unable is what we're focused on. And the data sharing frameworks, which are described in the white paper, are starting to inform the Intergovernmental Agreement. It will need to be mapped into policy language as opposed to the language that's of technical teams. It's also helping to inform an international standard, which is, hang on to your seats, ISO IEC JTC1 SC32 Working Group 6. There, I got it. I got to the end and only a couple of people fell asleep while I was saying that. But that standard is being brought to life, informed by that white paper. And different parts of that, going back to the smart city, smart places, that broad landscape around AI, digital twins, cybersecurity, Internet of Things, that's also being informed by the standardization work. So I started from the very beginning by saying that smart city, smart places and AI may not seem to be so relevant to this group, but in practice, it's all one conversation around data sharing and use. Increasingly, we're starting to converge on what we need to address in order to appropriately share data. And that's starting to manifest in different ways, either in policy language or in hard technical language or in language which human beings can understand. And hopefully, as we move into 2022, the conversation will move from how do we do it? How do we build these frameworks to these are examples for different sorts of data. And the conversation will move to the next most important thing is, should we be doing this? How appropriate is it for us to be using this data for this purpose? How far should we go with this use of data? And ultimately, really the most important thing out of this, the entire set of words that I've just offered up to you, is that we are trying to build trustworthy frameworks in anticipation of ultimately building trusted data sharing communities. Trustworthiness is what we can demonstrate. We know what we're doing. We have the domain expertise. We have the technical capability. We have the governance. We have the chain of custody. We have the chain of authority. We can demonstrate we're doing the right thing from a trustworthiness perspective. But ultimately, this is all about trust. And in order for data to flow in a systematic way, we need there to be trusted data sharing frameworks where we can address much more readily that unwilling, because ultimately it's about trust. We can more reasonably put in place frameworks that address that unable, and ultimately, when we get clarity around the different legislations, we can much more readily address that not allowed. So with that, Christy, I might pause and hand back to you and have a sip of my coffee.
Thanks, Ian. There are some questions dropping into the chat, so I'm going to ask that in one moment. I just want to ask you, there's so much that you described that's happened at a national level and a state level to enable the data sharing frameworks, and we understand the importance of that, particularly given so many people here on the call today are working to get better outcomes either on the ground in communities or are facilitating or wanting to facilitate data sharing with each other or between government agencies. Can you talk more about what this means for local communities, for people on the ground? Because we've all of us, I think, in the room today have experienced the challenge of not being able to access the data that gives us the information that's needed for those better decisions, for better outcomes in local communities.
Yes, I could talk for days on this without drawing breath. I have experienced the frustration myself, and my approach to trying to deal with these problems is, first of all, to be really clear about the why, so getting those outcomes described as well as possible, so that you can at least speak to, is it worth the effort, and what is it you're trying to achieve? And that helps a great deal. It also moves the conversation away from the nuts and bolts to, this is really important, and this is why it's important, this is why it would make a difference. And every time I try to tackle a data sharing problem, we start with the outcomes frameworks, which is the articulation of why. The next issue, of course, is, it actually does speak to those other issues of where is the data, who understands the data quality in the context under which it was gathered, and can I give it to? And so helping work through those, first of all, identification of the finite set of issues, not the infinite set of concerns, but the finite set of issues that you need to speak to, helps a great deal. So the problem moves from, I just don't know what I can do and what I can't do, and that sense of helplessness, to these are the questions we need to address, these are the issues we need to understand. And once we've narrowed that down, it becomes essentially a checklist of let's speak to how it got to you, let's speak to issues of data quality, let's speak to issues of appropriate access. And then once you've addressed those framework issues, it's important to pilot something first. And it's important to think about giving the data back, in particular, nothing about me without me. That sort of approach actually is really quite powerful. If you can demonstrate not only that you can do it, but you can give back a meaningful result to the people who are the data subjects. And if you can demonstrate how that insight or that analysis or that data product can be used in a way that helps local communities, then I think many of the issues start to become easier to deal with. And having said that, there's nothing in data which is easy, but they become easier to deal with.
Thanks, Ian. We'll come back a little bit about what you see might be possible in as things evolve next year. And we know that, you know, we're really excited about facilitating and intermediating data sharing, and grateful to have Department of Social Services and many of our SPSP community organisations on here today. And I have a question from Kylie Burgess, who is in Burnie and is an incredible leader at Burnie Works. And Kylie asks, how can trustworthiness be translated at the intersection between the data collection and use and translation into social policies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So to some extent, it's important for data custodians, technical people, policy people, domain experts to work together. And that may sound like an overly cumbersome process, but ultimately it is the process that you need to put in place. If technical people do technical stuff without domain experts, then you're lost. You might produce an interesting insight, but it will go absolutely nowhere. If policy people don't have access to data, don't have the technical skills to access the data, then we keep doing the same things we've always been doing forever, which is lived experience scaled up, applied to a bigger problem. And we often find that doesn't work. Lived experience typically doesn't scale. And common sense typically isn't that common when you try to apply it to a broad problem as opposed to a narrow problem. So ultimately, it is important to get technical and domain and policy people working together. It's really important to really argue through the outcomes that you're trying to deliver. And any attempt at shortcut will fall short eventually. So the way that at least I've been trying to address recently is big picture, agreement on the big picture, come back to the smallest possible thing you could do with the least number of stakeholders, with the smallest amount of data, with the fewest resources that actually prove you can do something, credibly build an understanding of the use of the methodology, and then build the case for change to take the next step, more data, more users, more resources, and more risk, where you emphasize the things that you believe are working, de-emphasize those things that you either know don't work or can't see working, and experiment in a stepwise fashion, building the case for change over time.
Thanks, Ian. Kylie, if does that answer your question? Yeah.
Thanks, Ian. I think I'm sort of wanting to touch on some of the justice issues too. So just looking at some of the policies and the way that data has been used in the past for communities who are disadvantaged, like robo-debt. And there was in the chat just before me, someone's put up about the shift to funding through outcomes, and just that there's a gap. Like if some communities have got great investment or belong to a great government who have invested hugely in the capacity around all of these frameworks and the development of all the things you've been talking about, Ian, and congratulations to New South Wales, you know, will there be a divide because that investment keeps attracting investment, which then means larger organisations can do this stuff. So yeah, just throwing out some of the unintended justice and equity implications.
Yeah, Kylie, there's a lot from what you've just said, but let me do the easy stuff first. I'm genuinely concerned about a divide being created. Of course, we want New South Wales to accelerate and move forward, increasing use of data, and we've got a great minister, we've got great support at every level. I'm genuinely concerned that we cannot have multiple speeds in Australia. So one of the things that I'm trying to do is, with the Australian Computer Society, is every time we do something good in, let's be fair, good in New South Wales, or see something good in Victoria, or see something good in Queensland, we try to make sure it gets shared around the country. And of late, the smart cities in New South Wales, we have to say smart places, but smart cities activity in New South Wales has been, we've tried to replicate that around the states. And similarly with standards, if we create national standards with more than just New South Wales voice, then we have an opportunity to make sure that that's a really national set of frameworks as opposed to New South Wales frameworks. So the first point, that was the easy bit. The second part is outcomes are really, really hard for people to buy into, because you're actually trying to make a difference in the real world. And some of the challenges that we have, those wicked policy challenges, they're wicked because they have longevity. They are generational challenges. And most people have the levers in front of them and know how complex and difficult, in some cases, broken the system is. So in order to step back and say, I will work to deliver real world outcomes that I can't directly influence all of those levers, but I need to work in concert with other organisations. And on the positive side of the ledger, we could say that we don't know whether we can genuinely pull all the levers together. On the negative side of the ledger, we say we won't get the credit for the outcome, because it's not possible to say that my pulling of my lever led to that outcome. It's us working together. So getting people to work on outcomes is a tricky thing to do. It's really worth the effort. And I recently ran an exercise with the emergency services organisations in New South Wales, trying to talk about community resilience from a connectivity perspective. So it's a relatively non-personal but sensitive issue. So it's easy compared to what we're talking about with really human-centered, people-centered data. But nonetheless, getting fire and rescue and SES and ambulance and surf lifesaving on the same page was all about talking about outcomes and people seeing their own way into those outcomes credibly, not to the point of loss of credibility, but a credible but ambitious outcomes that we've talked about with community resilience. And then coming back to, and this is what we can do right now with a subset of the people in the room, with a subset of the data, with a subset of the resources that we're talking about, and everyone else can watch and learn and think about what the next step would be. It is really worth the effort. And as I think to the earlier question, there's no shortcut. Otherwise, we keep doing exactly the same thing and we keep getting the same result. That credibility of going on that journey is really, very important. In New South Wales, we are fortunate that we've had so many experiments with the Data Analytics Centre. So I stopped running it in 2019. We'd run 50 cases, 50 projects, of which most went nowhere, but we developed a really good method, and some of them went somewhere, and a couple of projects really, we knocked it out of the park. So people are more willing to believe in the outcomes approach. And so my advice to everyone everywhere is, if you see a good idea, borrow it unashamedly and just say, look, it's working over there, we can also do it. And then focus on those outcomes. But unfortunately, it does require lots of people to buy in, and there's no shortcuts between getting the technical, the policy, and the other folks together. The last bit around justice, that's really, really hard, because that's the serious end. As we develop our assurance framework, AI, police were the last group that we worked with. We worked with, again, sensitive and personal. We worked with not sensitive and not personal. We worked with sensitive and not personal. We worked with personal and not sensitive. Then we did police, because that's top right-hand corner in terms of the sensitivity. So we worked our way up. We learned as we went. We included police along the journey so they could watch what we were doing and they could be involved in what we were doing. And then we worked with them around their case. And it was a very respectful set of conversations, not easy conversations. There was quite a bit of discomfort with the folks in the room. That's a metaphorical room. But we got to a point where everybody's comfortable enough with what we're doing that we can take the next step together. And again, no shortcuts.
Thanks, Ian. I do have two questions that I'd love to address, and I'm wondering, Michael, if you would be happy to actually ask this. It's a great question around capacity and investing in not-for-profits. Would you be happy to ask Ian directly? I know that you've dropped it in the chat. I can read it out otherwise. To what extent, Ian, do governments have a responsibility to build the data and digital capability of NFPs and digital capability of charities as we're going to fund it? I think it's really around the question that relates to...
Oh, sorry, I can ask that question. I didn't realise.
I beg your pardon.
I didn't realise you were referring to me.
Sorry, Michael. I beg your pardon.
It's Matthew, that's why. Thank you, Doctor, for addressing us. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm interested in knowing to what extent do governments have a responsibility to actually build the data capability of not-for-profits and charities, and how are we going to fund that? Last week, the Federal Minister, Anne Ruston, told the Social Impact Measurement Network Australia Awards, she addressed that, and she said that she expects that there's going to be more government services that are going to be delivered through social impact investment, i.e. paying for outcomes. And so those same organisations are going to be heavily involved in the whole space of digital citizenship, as well as providing those services. Sorry, it's such a long question, but how those organisations are going to be expected to meet those government expectations, but unless they have the capacity, they're not going to be able to. How are they going to press their case to build that capacity? Sorry for such a long question.
Thank you, Matthew. It's exactly the right question, and I think here I'm not qualified to speak on behalf of government in any stripe. What I will say from a personal perspective is that it's being able to share data in a community of people working towards a common goal is absolutely essential for a couple of reasons. One is that we all have really useful data, which it's a no regrets move to improve our own data analysing and sharing capability, just for our own purposes, just for the selfish purpose of understanding how well we're doing individually. It's really important to be able to share data between organisations to understand how effective the ecosystem is in terms of delivery. It's really important to be able to share data to see whether or not we're all really moving towards those outcomes and the indicators we're talking about. So data capacity uplift is a no regrets activity, and I believe everybody should be budgeting a component of their funds towards improving their own capability, improving the capability of the ecosystem. That's my perspective, my individual perspective. Some people still are not quite on that point of understanding the value of data, because historically it hasn't been that useful. Historically, there's a whole lot of data that just gets effectively ignored because of issues of data quality, because of issues of the circumstances under which it was captured. I cannot tell you the number of times that people have just rubbished a result because they said, you don't understand how that data was captured. It has no value whatsoever, in which case, why do you capture it? So, so specifically to your question, I think it should be part of every conversation. I think it should be normal to be saying, and what is the data capability uplift part of our project, of our program, of our service? And increasingly, we should all be saying that it's a no regrets fundamental skill set capability that we all need to have. So let's ensure that when we're shaping programs, that we shape that into it from the beginning. And then I suggest you read the technical white paper from last Thursday. Cracking read.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Matthew. I know we've got a couple of minutes after. Ian, have you got time for one more question?
Sure.
Oh, thank you so much. I do have a question from Grania. Would you like to ask that directly, Grania?
Yes, thanks. Good morning, Ian. It's Grania O'Loughlin, CEO at Karitani. How are you? Thanks for an informative morning. We have embraced outcomes data collection for many years in the health sector. We traverse the health and social services sector, and so, you know, the discussion about the need to gather outcomes data is absolutely pertinent and poignant. But we have found it extraordinarily challenging to find data capture systems that clinicians can collect data on, B, aggregate that data into something meaningful, and then to, you know, influence government with that data, whether it's return on investment data or outcomes data, and that's sort of the holy grail, that you're efficient and effective. where our barriers have come is that we collect it through CRMs and we collect it through other platforms that don't integrate well with health. And we're often asked to pay for security assessments for interfaces from apps and whatnot that can be $40,000 and take 12 months. So the bigger prospect, I guess, for not-for-profits and NGOs, particularly in that interface where there's health data and health-related data, is a challenge. What do you think as we move towards the AI environment of how we might solve that together?
So I sympathise, I empathise. When I started at the Data Analytics Centre, I was much, much younger. My hair was not so grey and my forehead was not as flat. It has been a really hard journey to get to the point where we are in New South Wales. The first thing is you're not alone, so take some comfort in that. It also be a little despairing that you're not alone. Don't reinvent anything. If a framework exists, if there's someone who's already doing it, use that. Never let a good idea go unborrowed. Never let a good system or process go unadopted. Be part of a community of people who are genuinely solving problems as opposed to just talking about solving problems. One of the things that really frustrates me is people who just talk about problems but don't work with the folks who actually could solve those problems. And that's the point about bringing the technical and the policy and other such folks together. And you can find really empowered communities who are busily doing this sort of stuff. But some of it is going to be, well, in fact, I think for a long time, there will be case-by-case conversations about building the trust through demonstrating that trustworthiness by acknowledging the frameworks, by acknowledging the different components that are necessary, by speaking to the different concerns and sensitivities. Things like security checks, unfortunately, every single time you undertake a new combination of things, you probably will get hit with that. If there's a way of sharing that cost or a way of sharing those frameworks with others, then that's a good thing to do. Some of it, though, is going to be every single time, but the more of those 100 different issues you need to address, the more of those you can share with the community, and then only deal with those remaining ones on a case-by-case basis, the faster you'll move forward. And to the point made earlier, to Kylie's point made earlier, as you start to succeed, you will almost certainly succeed more often because you've got the systems and processes and repeatable patterns, and you start to narrow down that marginal cost, that marginal effort. But it's a really slow and frustrating process to get to that, to get any momentum at all. But it's wonderful when your sled starts to move. But there's always some friction. I'm mixing lots of analogies here, but anyway, there's always some friction. But when the sled starts to move, it's a wonderful feeling.
Thank you. Thanks. Agree. The sled is moving. Christmas is coming.
Thank you so much. I know we're out of time. I would really ask Ian, in 1 minute, can you give us a hit forecast for 2022 when it comes to data sharing with the not-for-profit and social sector, community sector, and also for NFP capacity building? What do you reckon is going to happen?
I think we are winning the data conversation in terms of data sharing. Not entirely there yet, but I think we're winning it. So to Matthew's point, I think that the more of us that are having the conversation about the need for data sharing and speaking directly to that unable component, not the unwilling, not the not allowed, but speaking to the unable component, and this has to be capacity building as part of everything we're doing, the better off we'll be. And I think there are more voices starting to say more similar things. So I really do expect that conversation, I expect that sled to start moving. The big issues next year will become, should we be doing this? And I think there'll be a lot of conversations around the appropriateness of use of data, because as we start to do it, those sensitivities and sensibilities will start to surface. So I look forward to those conversations in 2022.
Thank you. Well, if there's no further ideas or questions, I really want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us today, especially the week before we break out. I really do appreciate it. It's lovely to see you all, and we love working with you all too. Look forward to 2022, and thank you again. And thank you, Ian, for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.